Unfuck the Poor, Chapter 5. What is a dollar?
1619. This is a project that is destroying our country.
The project is a series of writings released in 2019 that try to reframe U.S. history and put slavery at the center of our national narrative.
The 1619 curriculum is already in thousands of schools across all 50 states. Is it in yours? If it is, you must get it out.
Most of our forefathers, all of our main founding fathers, were against slavery.
Slavery has been a feature of societies across time and place. Freedom is what makes America unique, not slavery. Freedom is what makes America unique. We are a country based on freedom, not on slavery.
In 5 years of doing this, I've not had anybody name a second slave owner of Signer's Declaration other than Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. When you told Sally Hemings that you would free her children to remain your mistress, did you think there was honor in your ultimatum? James Monroe. When you proposed sending slaves back to Africa, did black bodies feel like rented tools? When you branded them, did the scar on their chest include an expiration date? James Madison. When you wrote to Congress that black people should count as 3/5 of a person, how long did you have to look at your slaves to figure out the math? George Washington. When you won the revolution, how many of your soldiers did you send from the battlefield to the cotton field? Andrew Jackson. Was the Trail of Tears not enough for you? Was killing Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles not enough to quench your imperialism?
It is a very serious effort to brainwash an entire generation of American youth that their nation is a fraud and must be corrected.
Oppression doesn't disappear just because you decided not to teach us that chapter. If you only hear one side of the story, at some point you have to question who the writer is.
Get out of the fucking car, Atlanta police!
So you're standing by this comment that the Founding Fathers worked tirelessly to end slavery?
To understand a currency is to understand a nation, and to understand the U.S. dollar, the path to understanding lies just beyond a thick tangle of ideas that make no fucking sense when you tread carefully. Thankfully, many Americans wield a giant truth-destroying hatchet that gets them to the other side where the dollar is, allowing an even thicker tangle of bullshit to grow in the clearing. For example, are we a democracy or a republic? Do we believe in big government or states' rights? Fuck if I know. The American thought process has become so lizard-like that some people believe real-life lizard people run the government, and also Jewish space lasers. Anyway, democracy is power vested in the people. It does not have to be a government power. It can be a democratically led business like a cooperative, one in which workers share ownership and responsibility and vote on company policy. It favors majority rule. Policies with the most support win. Republic means power is vested in representatives of the people. It is true that majority interests can be represented by elected officials, but the key is that the republic serves to protect the interests of the minority against the power of the majority. A republic requires a large government of consolidated power to bring order to commerce and to create a cohesive, coercive force, which is good for dealing with other countries. Big government. No matter how you cut it, the United States is a big government. It is physically large and the people are spread out geographically. It also holds big power over banks, corporations, war-making, and stuff like preemption and creating currency. States' rights. In the U.S. specifically, any and all power not specified by the U.S. Constitution falls to the states. When a legal case makes it to the Supreme Court, the argument boils down to this. In a particular court case, the rules of the Constitution do not apply, and the states reserve the right to do as they please. If you pay attention to public discourse, the way you and I talk about the world, and you keep in mind these four definitions, the American psyche appears to have been pummeled by centuries of deliberate illiteracy. Modern conservative psychology requires multiple contradictory beliefs to be held at once. 1. The federal government is incompetent, therefore its powers should be limited and the states should be autonomous. But I guess the federal government can still issue currency. That's okay. Because the federal government is incompetent, large-scale programs that the government is in charge of should be abandoned or not attempted. This includes schools, healthcare, food assistance, and insurance, but does not include Social Security and prisons until it does. The solution is to privatize everything. 3, we do not live in a democracy, meaning we do not vote directly on anything. Our elected representatives legislate for us, and the system of checks and balances ensures that a single group cannot control the nation, unless the group controlling the nation is your political party. Then it's okay, because that's just politics and your side is correct anyway, so it doesn't matter. 4, because we do not live in a democracy, we therefore must live in a republic, which, if you recall, means that we need a large consolidated government. 5, because we live in a republic yet believe the large centralized government is incompetent, the only thing that matters is the interest of the self. The large centralized government is acceptable as long as the interests of the self are preserved. And yes, I do mean the self, as in selfish things like individual freedoms, meaning rights to private property. Those are valued above public or social rights. 6, because the interests of the self lie within an individual's immediate surroundings, states' rights are more important than the will of the government, which is incompetent. 7, because states' rights are analogous to self-interest, elected representatives serving the self and not the other are preferable. 8, because we are a republic of the self, any beliefs held by the other are intolerable and unjustified. 9, as long as the government serves the self-interest, any rights or freedoms denied all citizens is justified because it is assumed they will only negatively affect the other. 10, because freedoms are negotiable, it is acceptable to hold such opinions as A, we do not need the popular vote. The Electoral College is capable of serving the self-interest. B, education and healthcare are privileges and not human rights. Taxes should not pay for either. C, civil rights are a form of discrimination. They unjustly provide preferential treatment to one group of citizens over another. D, the freedom of choice is unnecessary if you believe in the moral superiority of your choice. In other words, you would never make the other choice, so it should not even be a choice. And E, disagreement is a form of censorship. So how do people whose ideology is based on the premise that a large consolidated government is needed to check the state's autonomy come to terms with the fact that the majority of their personal beliefs revolve around the autonomy of their states? Well, they just kind of ignore it. The beauty of ignoring it is that nothing else down the line has to make any sense. When the underlying value of an asset disappears, everything that follows is worthless. Are you sensing the theme yet? We do need to discuss some more economic principles. That is how I sold this book to you after all. But first, you know how in, say, time-lapse videos it appears like the solar system just glides across the sky, or how plants seem to like breathe and stretch? Basically how all the unnoticeable things become apparent when you speed up time. Panic buying is basically a time-lapse of the consumer economy. So here we go. Scarcity. There are finite resources on this planet, so that naturally creates competition. This only applies to consumers. If you are making money, there is no end to the number of zeros that can be added to a dollar amount. Do you remember how at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, liquor companies were suddenly making hand sanitizer and all your friends began sewing masks and you were like, hey, I didn't know you could sew, and hey, I didn't know you could turn vodka into a gross, sticky gel? Well, scarcity creates voids in the market where, like magic, people find the resources to fill them. Now, more traditionally, scarcity is seen as a value adder, but this is not really the case. Scarcity is a market maker. Rarity is what holds value. There is only one limit imposed on the producer, and that is productivity. Renewable resources can only mature at a given rate, and it takes a lot of forethought to make sure you don't run out. Of course, if it's a non-renewable item, you can just imagine that you're at a disadvantage from the start. So how do you get as much for yourself as possible? Supply and demand. If everyone panics during a pandemic and buys toilet paper, then they exhaust the available supply and create huge demand. The inability of toilet paper companies to ramp up supply to meet accelerated demand suggests a few flaws in the basic economic principle of supply and demand, namely that demand is calculated rather than measured. Well, let me go into that. Supply and demand tells us that toilet paper prices should have exploded when everybody started buying it at the start of the pandemic, but prices didn't go up. Instead, companies had to figure out what the fuck was wrong with their supply chains to crank out as much paper as they could. Now, wouldn't it have been exploitative to take advantage of a pandemic? It would have been. And economists would say this is an exception to the rule, but what rule would that be? What exception? The rule that pricing should be naturally set by demand because the rule is exploitation is what we chose to put on hold. Costs and benefits. The rule that says we human consumers are supposed to be perfectly logical in all situations. We will always work out the highest value and best use when selecting a product and spending our money. And if you don't, fuck you, because you shoulda. Well, panic buying kind of shows you that when really pressed for it, customers really don't give a shit what kind of toilet paper they get. They just need fucking toilet paper. Do you think in the midst of rushing the shelves, shoppers were like, okay, I can get 12 rolls here at $20 and I'm grabbing 20 packs, so that's $400, but they're triple ply and quilted, so I'll get more mileage out of one square than the 2-ply pleated 18 pack at $15. Hell, by the time you do all that, you're stuck with 1-ply and everybody's punching each other in the head trying to grab it. It's a whole thing. Incentives are how to get people to do what you want, which if you are a producer, what you want people to do is part with their money. So an incentive is basically just a way to get you to part with your money. We can all say that pandemic buying is essentially some crazy phenomenon that doesn't happen all the time, but marketers understand that this is exactly what happens every time you look at their bullshit on the shelves. No one really gives a fuck about toilet paper. In fact, giving a fuck about toilet paper is a luxury that flies out the window when you realize you don't have time to indulge in luxury. Now, you might consider coupons, rebates, discounts for joining a service, and tax credits as incentives, but to the person standing in front of a wall of toilet paper, which is an endless supply in normal times, there will always be a more subtle incentive, a marketing incentive, like that voice in your head saying, don't squeeze the Charmin. And then you kind of reflexively put the Charmin in your fucking hands. Does it really feel better when you wipe, or do you just subconsciously grab it and squeeze it because it's funny, and then since you're already holding it, you just say, fuck it, I'll use this. The American shopping experience is a luxury in itself. Look at all this shit I can buy. So many choices, but how do I choose? An incentive makes us think we're using our cost-benefit analyzing skills because we are suddenly thinking about what we're going to purchase. Incentives are the rationale behind parting with money. Bonus. For the last thing I'll say on this, and this is purely to poke holes, what possible incentive and cost-benefit analysis could you have for preferring Coke to Pepsi or Pepsi to Coke? Both are sweet brown caffeinated fizzy waters that taste quite similar, but no matter how many coupons you throw their way, customers will always choose their favorite. Further, what circumstances would have to take place for the demand of Coke and Pepsi to suddenly change? I mean, people are already guzzling sodas at full gut capacity in spite of ample warnings about high fructose corn syrup. The principle states that scarcity should increase demand, but Coke doesn't do scarcity. They do market saturation. Everywhere you go, Coke. Coke is everywhere, and when you order at a restaurant and they only have Pepsi, you can't fucking believe it. It's Coke, for Christ's sake, not Moet. That's not scarcity, that's barbarism. In fact, it's double not scarcity because you demanded Coke and they didn't have it, but you didn't get up and run to the gas station to grab a Coke, did you? Did you offer your server $20 if she'd just run out and grab a Coke because it's fucking scarce in this restaurant and goddammit, we need to flood this place with sweet brown water? No. What'd you do? You ordered something fucking else because it doesn't fucking matter. This is, of course, just another small lesson in microeconomics. We're talking about products, after all, not sweeping economic principles. But if you haven't guessed by now, I'm actually making a much larger point, and things are getting good. So those 4 bullshit principles that I just explained with Coke and toilet paper, those are the foundations of economic theory: scarcity, supply and demand, cost, benefit, and incentives. They're not so much foundations as they are mandates because they tell the consumer what is expected of us when we enter the marketplace. We're expected to visualize our choices in these 4 terms because that helps us be rational, fully functioning human beings. And when I say enter the marketplace, I'm not talking about walking into Walmart. I'm talking about waking up in the fucking morning because seriously, literally, we're surrounded by fucking advertisements 24/7. If you take these 4 principles at face value, you might think you're gaining insight into how to make better choices. Maybe you didn't have a good economic role model growing up, someone who budgeted and saved and didn't seem too stressed when the bills came but paid them diligently. So you didn't learn how to buy things or how to interact with the market. Well, that's fine because these 4 principles form the basis for making all the best financial decisions of your life. Further, because they are the functional rules of economics, it must follow that all the players, corporations, manufacturers, the government, the wealthy, follow these same principles as well. It is a fair system based on fundamental laws that can't and don't change. We all come to the table with the same advantages and disadvantages. But There's a reason I started with a diatribe on GameStop and the history of assholes in the office of the comptroller of the currency instead of scarcity, supply and demand, cost and benefits, and incentives. We've already seen that these rules aren't exactly fair, nor are they consistent, and in the examples cited, they certainly are not reality. You can Google what is economics, and somewhere at the top will be these 4 concepts because they aren't secrets and they really don't offer you anything of value. Well, if you think really critically, they do offer something of value. If you keep them in mind, you will indeed save yourself a lot of money because you won't get caught up in all the bullshit of being sold things you don't need. Example, before mobiles, we had landlines. Now, I know, I'm old. But buying a phone wasn't a thing that people did, not in any meaningful way, until the rise of the cell phone. In the 90s, the closest any of us kids could get to the cell phone was the wireless handset, and you had to have the longest range possible so you could be as far away from the base as possible. And that was only relatively recent as well. For years, people just bought 50-foot curly cords and stretched them all over the house, and this was all just to have a private conversation with your friends at 11 o'clock at night. Now, I could just as well be describing the mundanity of indoor plumbing or the apparent fact that we're all supposed to purchase cars. The point is, these things become integral to our lives in their own unique way, and once they become integral, they become expected. That expectation is the market, and everything before the expectation is curiosity or speculation. The principle of scarcity says that the reason we make choices, the reason we have to make a choice, is because there are limited resources. Otherwise, you just have everything all the time. This is a dumb concept. Don't get me wrong. We have limited time, money, energy, and physical resources on this planet, but that's not why we choose mobile phones. Consider how you buy one. You look at the cost, sure, maybe how many cameras it has, maybe. But at this point, are phones really any different? If you're poor, you just get, a simple mobile plan and whatever is cheapest. If you have money, you buy what looks nice or what is popular. But you're only choosing between phones, of which there are arguably too many, not scarce at all. Same when car shopping. You can buy a Honda or a Ford, mostly the same thing when you squint, but we are not choosing between a car and high-speed rail or a car and no car. We're not choosing between a phone and no phone or a phone and telepathy. No phone and telepathy are not options. Other high-tech methods of communicating with each other are simply not available. When alternatives are scarce, the market becomes saturated. In America, transportation is kind of saturated with cars because high-speed rail is not an option. And this only goes for America because fuck you, Europe and Japan and China and everywhere else with your efficiency and your public transportation. In other words, those things are not part of the market economy, which is supposed to be the best economy, right? Because that's what America has, right? A market economy is the result of businesses and organizations making independent decisions and you, the consumer, making any decision you want so long as it takes place within their market. The government doesn't tell the people what to buy and it doesn't tell companies what to make. Freedom. Because of this freedom, with the consumer making informed decisions in a relatively free market, being sold things without government influence, the consumer and the producer find natural harmony. Not just harmony, but equilibrium. What is good for the consumer is good for the producer and vice versa. In fact, this system works so well that what is good for one is good for all. The rules are the same for both sides. Holy shit, the solution to all our problems this entire time has been to just let the market do whatever the fuck it wants and sit back and enjoy it because we're all fucking winners. Well, until the economy crashes, just a slight bug in the software, if you will, is the regular recurrence of the dreaded recession, but not a depression. Thank fuck we have economists to tell us that even though millions of people are losing their jobs and home values are collapsing, this is definitely just like any other normal recession and not a depression, so please, for the love of God, don't panic and don't do anything irrational like revolt against all the people who made this happen in hopes of a better society. And even though recessions occur regularly, 1973, 1981, 1990, 2001, 2007, that's like once a fucking decade, we can rely on the economists to tell us what went wrong, which is nothing because recessions are normal. The problem is that economists also get us into this shit in the first place and then perpetuate it. Remember the purchase and assumption dissertation mentioned in the intermission? It's a complex equation that justifies the use of a financial agreement between the government and a corporation that, as a side effect, results in the exploitation of the poor. Now, this same kind of economic thinking, model making, and intense analysis went into the justification used by banks when they decided financial institutions. The same justification used by financial institutions when they decided trading mortgage-backed securities wasn't as risky as you'd think it would be. And after the fact, when standing in the rubble of civilization, they get to say things like, oh, well, the model was wrong, whoops, and people like Steve Mnuchin say there were a lot of issues. So the reason we have to make a choice is because options are limited. Another way of looking at it, the reason we're given so many choices is because the alternatives are scarce. Non-existent, really. In a market economy, the government doesn't do dictates. The thinking goes like this. If the government commands a producer to make something, there is a high probability that the incompetent government is going to get the target wrong, and then suddenly we will be spending too much money, we'll be making too much stuff that people don't need, or we will be stuck with not being able to distribute whatever was made to the people, or the thing that we make will be 100% wrong. Say 100 million hats shaped like foreskin that no one wants to buy, for example. Because, the government's incompetent. The command economy of the Soviet Union failed, and look where it got them. Crumbling infrastructure, a massive state propaganda machine, and a president who pretends not to be a psychopath, but quite obviously is. You could say the same about the United States. The same dictate that an incompetent government should not be ordering the construction of something like high-speed rail or funding green infrastructure falls under that wise maxim, the market will take care of it if you just leave it alone. And a maxim, if you don't know, is an understood truth in a nutshell. So we have now prepared ourselves with the basic conflicts of the American experiment, republic versus democracy, big government versus states' rights, and the four fundamental principles of economics: scarcity, supply and demand, cost and benefits, and incentives. So let's proceed. Are you a liberal or a conservative, a Democrat or Republican? There's no right or wrong answer, but whatever you say, you're a liberal. Allow me to explain. The market economy is liberalism, and you and I live in it. We make choices every single day. And it's not exactly classical liberalism in the real sense, but this is capital liberalism. Do you like private property and corporations, private production? Do you believe in free trade and open competition? When Democrats and Republicans argue and make fun of each other, it's hilarious because no one has any idea what a liberal is, and they get even more confused when they bring up neoliberals. Neoliberalism is the extreme form of the free market, basically laissez-faire, one in which privatization is pushed as good fiscal policy, along with globalization, deregulation, and cutting government spending. Austerity for the poor, obviously, but not the rich. Laissez-faire. Let it go. Nope. Laissez-faire. I pronounce it this way because I was raised in the South and taught English by other people who are raised in the South, so I say it differently. So anyway, laissez-faire. Let it go economics. The economic system runs entirely independent of the government. Privatization. Ownership and control of resources by private parties like corporations rather than the state. When neoliberals push for privatizing Social Security or education, they are talking about corporations doing things they think our government shouldn't do, like providing retirement assistance or providing education or healthcare. We have privatized much of our criminal justice system to corporations, which is super fucked if you pause to think about it, but then you realize, well, we also have a cash bail system, and that is more super fucked because isn't that just punishing poor people for being poor? And before you say they are criminals, just recall that without a fair trial, there is no such thing as being guilty of a crime. Globalization. That sounds harmless, right? Imperial capitalism or neocolonialism would explain the concept just as well. The soft definition is used to describe the fact that we live in a more connected world and we can fast ship stuff from China. Now, the hard definition would be the idea that using state power, we destabilize foreign countries and then, quote, invest in their reconstruction by making them adopt trade policies with consumer countries and then exploit their cheap labor in emerging economies. Totally harmless. Deregulation. See also that time Joseph Otting was comptroller, and because he didn't like the CRA, he made it easier for banks to be accredited under CRA rules and effectively stripped the requirement that they serve low and moderate income communities. See also the repeal of mine safety inspection guidelines by the Trump administration because it helped mining companies save money by not having to keep their mines to a minimum safety standard, which is exactly the kind of thing you don't worry about when you're a quarter mile into the earth and work in an industry where at least once a year the headline mine collapse comes on the news. And why are we so fucking obsessed with private property and privatization in general? And why the fuck does it tie in so nicely with liberalism and its perverted cousin, neoliberalism? It might have something to do with how this country was founded, not out of good old God-given American freedom, but because it was very important not to let land be distributed equally amongst the citizens of the country. Oh shit, am I Am I talking shit about the birth of this nation? Yes, indeed I am. Imagine it's 1760 and you're sitting in your pantaloons talking to Ben Franklin and he's like, England is great and all, but America's better, and it'd be great if when George II dies in October, he just, give us his country. That way we could have our country and not have a monarchy. I mean, can you imagine a country of aristocrats where the money has our faces on it? And you're like, yeah, that'd be neat, but hey, how'd you know George II is going to die in October? And then Ben Franklin's like, a little wiki bird told me. It got up early before the worm, and then you're like, oh, fuck, you're weird, Ben. Tell me more about this aristocracy with our faces on the money. Well, you know how all our money has King George's face on it, and then it has the faces of all those other people who live across the ocean, and they have those sweet ponytails? Well, what if it was our faces on the money? Wait, Ben, shut up. What if the faces were ours, and then, but also on our money that was our money, our faces were on it, and we got to decide how much we paid in taxes? Oh, that's a pretty good idea, Mr. Madison. If your father died in 1801 and bequeathed 100 slaves to you, would you keep them in this new aristocracy? What? You mean the private property of my father that would become my property if inherited? Indeed I would, Ben. Indeed I would. Oh, good. Let's all keep our slaves. Huzzah! Wait. Why did you say if my father dies in 1801? Wikipedia would say Ben Franklin, and then he'd pop a balloon in your face to shut you up. So in this fairly accurate historic fabrication, you are 9-year-old James Madison, and Ben Franklin is, gross, 54. You, James Madison, father of the Constitution, would wind up on only one U.S. Treasury note, the $5,000 bill. Franklin would go on to be recognized as the face of the $100 bill, Benjamin's, you might call him today, and as the fourth man standing on the back of the $2 bill. That's not important, but they did both own slaves, which is very important. But their fake conversation is also pretty important. England was great, admired by the Founding Fathers as one of the best examples of what a modern government should and could be. England was a global superpower with an established three-tiered social order with their own form of internal governance, Parliament. The royals followed the rules of the monarchy, born to inherent power and immunity from the other classes. Fun fact, Queen Elizabeth still holds ultimate inherent power. She walks very softly and carries a very large stick. Nobility followed the rules of the aristocracy through power granted by the monarchs and the inheritance of land, property, and title. And the commons practiced democracy. They elected people to represent them in Parliament because individually no one was important or had power. Neat. The three groups convened in Parliament, though this would be sticky later on, and they acted in check with each other so that they might all live in relative harmony. Each group protected their own rights from the encroachment of the others, and that kept things running smoothly so that no one really dominated. And when you look at it in this context, it's remarkable that such a power structure managed to emerge at all in world history, usually a history of invasions and harsh rule. It is quite the brilliant example of soft power exercised by the crown. To maintain immunity and ultimate power, you grant powers to those living in the kingdom, and ultimately you don't fuck it up by being insane or bankrupting the country. This structure had allowed England to build and maintain a significant amount of power while at the same time not falling into the hands of utter tyrants. Don't get me wrong, the rich were filthy rich and the poor were dirt poor. Inequality and wealth distribution were definitely not a thing, but as a matter of power structure, it is at least interesting. All that changed around the time the colonists were just setting up their own little Commonwealth states. Instead of Parliament being a place where the commoners sent their representatives to represent their interests, Parliament became the place where the representatives were just delegates. They were sent to represent part of the nation and not necessarily the people they represented. In other words, it transformed Parliament into a, quote, deliberate assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole, where not local purposes, not local prejudices ought to guide, but the general good resulting from the general reason of the whole. It's like this. Gary would go off to Parliament and sit around listening to what England was going to do to the colony, and when he went home, everyone was just like, shit, Gary, did you at least say something? And Gary would shake his head no, because they were beheading people in those days, and there's no way he was getting his head cut off. So that's the representation thing. It's this representation thing, not taxes specifically, that got into Madison's young slave-holding pantaloons. The American colony was represented in England by basically a Gary, who was just there to represent England's interest in the colony rather than represent the colony's interest in England. Instead of taxation without representation, it was really representation without representation. Well, fuck that, says Madison, and fuck that he did. And democracy has always been fragile. In medieval England, you had the realm over which the monarchy reigned, and within the realm you had other royalty or aristocrats with power over the land and animals. And this was a long-ass time ago. The Charter of the Forest, 1217, took back some rights to the land that had been increasingly put into private or royal or aristocratic hands and restricted from the commoners. Now, back then, land is a big deal. That's where you set up pig pastures, collect firewood, graze your animals, and cut turf, like peat, for fuel. Land is historically a vital component of economics. The Charter of the Forest was a pretty significant piece of paper. It established specific rights of commoners to use the land for subsistence. But in 1236, King Henry III and English land barons entered into an agreement, the Statute of Merton, which cut into the rights of the Charter of the Forest, allowing for the enclosure of common land by barons. In theory, the enclosure of the commons, as it is known, shouldn't have been a big deal. The barons could enclose the commons, but they had to leave enough for the tenants to do their pig and firewood thing. Enclosure isn't history. Like, it's not just a thing that happened and now it's done. It's still studied and debated in modern contexts. Like, was it good for us or was it bad? And it's done in great detail. It's also studied by economic historians or just modern economists who want to revise history, but it's really hard to tell what the fuck they're after. But there are two general modes of thought. One, enclosure was a noble effort to make land use and agriculture more efficient and sustainable because commoners weren't smart enough to keep their pigs and sheep off each other's crops. And enclosure wasn't that bad because some of the land was reconverted to arable land when wool prices dropped. That's the economist perspective. And two, the other belief was that enclosure was actually worse than it sounds because the real sheep numbers don't reflect the economic belief that less enclosure equaled fewer sheep, actually the opposite. As agricultural historian John Martin noted that there were a shitload of sheep in the county of Northamptonshire, smack in the middle of the enclosure movement, during the period when there should have been fewer. In 1564, there were 39,900 sheep in the western division of Northamptonshire and 69,980 sheep in the eastern division. Now, those numbers mean jack shit to you, I'm sure, but the takeaway is this. During this time period, enclosed land was being reconverted to arable land, land for use by commoners, but the sheep population increased in enclosed land. By the 1400s, the landlords and large mercantile guilds worked to enclose more and more of the commons. The enclosed land, no longer available to the commoner, was used for private interest. The building of wealth through raising sheep for wool is one example. Now, you would be totally accurate in describing this as takeover by big wool. Wool was more profitable than farming, and the large mercantile guilds could guarantee a higher income for the exclusive rights to use private lands. Like every big commercial dream, there is also a big physical impact. Sheep are destructive. They strip lands and erode soils. And the privatization of lands once available to the commoners meant people were displaced, pushed out of their homes. But wooling was efficient and profitable, so fuck the poor. That was the start of it. The privatization of land ramped up again in the 1700s after we just discussed it died down a little bit in the middle of the 1500s. Anyway, through the 1860s, millions of acres were privatized through enclosure. Life wasn't too technologically complicated back then. You still needed firewood, land to graze, peat to burn, and then you had less of it because of enclosure. And this isn't just, oh, we have less land. This was devastating. It parallels the effects of mass foreclosure. John Clare, the 19th century poet, documented how enclosure affected the commoners who saw rivers turned into canals, lands stripped of trees and shrubbery, marshes drained. They became vagrants, unable to use the once public land. Clare himself was one of those displaced commoners. His family subsisted off the land that was destroyed. His were the people for whom, quote, enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labor's rights and left the poor a slave. For the poor, the underrepresented, and those displaced by the interests of the landowning class, democracy is the power of the many against that of the few. It isn't simply agreeing on who will be in charge. It is a matter of having the collective interest represented. To those with power in land, democracy is a dangerous thing. Too much power in the hands of the people means land gets turned over for public use. It means the poor, who have little to nothing to offer in terms of production other than their hard work and general well-being, have autonomy over themselves and, more importantly, freedom from exploitation by the wealthy. So what's wrong with democracy in this sense? The loss of massive profits from wool or oil or coal or mobile phones for that matter, or the loss of opportunity to use those things. The danger of democracy is, well, Let's go back to the aristocracy, those who were afraid of democracy. You want to know who else is an asshole? Robert Morris Jr., the superintendent of finance during the American Revolution, 1781. You could call him the comptroller of the day. He is also regarded as one of the founders of the American financial system. This guy, and I do not mean this in a derogatory way, was an old-school Republican. Morris believed in big government over states' rights because the states, if they had their say in electing representatives and senators, would be viewed by the world as weak and unstable. That is, because the states practiced democratic elections, common folk voting for common folk by majority consent, an entire government made of such common folk would be too impulsive, too inconsistent, and basically all around extra. Keep in mind that pantaloons were twisted over the way the American colony had been represented in England. They were treated as a monolith. Not only that, they were treated as subjects. And so Morris was blunt with those at the 1787 Federal Convention, to which he was invited and was given floor space. It had already been agreed upon by all of those who sat at the 1787 Convention that there would indeed be two branches of government similar to the English Parliament, and that each should be a check on the other. If you have two branches of government composed of the same people voted in democratically, then there could be no check on power. The English solution had been to give the people their democracy, so Robert Morris Jr. conceded that one branch should be elected by the people, let them have some democracy. But those at the convention were arguing over whether the people should have a say in the other branch. On July 2nd, 1787, Morris made the case for American aristocracy, even though there was no nobility in the colonies. All Americans, in the eyes of England at least, were the same common folk, but that was not reality. For Morris, there existed two Americas. Quote,
"The second branch ought to be composed of men of great and established property. An aristocracy, men who from pride will support consistency and permanency, and to make them completely independent they must be chosen for life, or they will be a useless body. Such an aristocratic body will keep down the turbulency of democracy, but if you elect them for a shorter period, they will only be a name, and we had better be without them. Thus constituted, I hope they will show us the weight of aristocracy. History proves, I admit, that the men of large property will uniformly endeavor to establish tyranny. How then shall we ward off this evil? Give them the second branch, and you secure their weight for the public good. They become responsible for their conduct, and this lust of power will ever be checked by the democratic branch, and thus form a stability in your government. But if we continue changing our measures by the breath of democracy, who will confide in our engagements? Who will trust us? Ask any person whether he reposes any confidence in the government of Congress or that of the state of Pennsylvania. He will readily answer you no. Ask him the reason, and he will tell you it is because he has no confidence in their stability.
Morris was advocating for permanent positions for the American aristocracy. That means no term limits, just appointed for life. But he wasn't alone. Morris was echoing or summarizing a point more eloquently made days before by James Madison on June 26th.
But now we are forming a body on whose wisdom we mean to rely, and their permanency in office secures a proper field in which they may exert their firmness and knowledge. Democratic communities may be unsteady and be led to action by the impulse of the moment. Like individuals, they may be sensible of their own weakness and may desire the counsels and checks of friends to guard them against the turbulency and weakness of unruly passions. Such are the various pursuits of this life that in all civilized countries the interest of the community will be divided. There will be debtors and creditors and an unequal possession of property, and hence arise different views and different objects in government. This indeed is the groundwork of aristocracy, and we find it blended in every government, both ancient and modern. Even where titles have survived property, we discover the noble beggar, haughty and assuming. The man who is possessed of wealth, who lolls on his sofa or rolls in his carriage, cannot judge of the wants or feelings of the day laborer. The government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent. But in process of time, when we approximate to the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small, through the various means of trade and manufactures, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections? And unless wisely provided against, what will become of your government? In England at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of the landed proprietors would be insecure, and agrarian law would soon take place. If these observations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation. Landholders ought to have a share in the government to support these invaluable interests and to balance and check the other. They ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The Senate, therefore, ought to be this body, and to answer these purposes, they ought to have permanency and stability.
These aren't just the ramblings of old-school Republicans. The problem with democracy was historical fact, or perceived historical fact. It was taken as matter of fact that direct democracy, people governing themselves, would result in societal collapse and in turn give itself up to a special kind of tyranny that, in the hands of a demagogue, would result in the polar opposite of democracy, the dictatorship. A permanent Senate of wealthy landowners would be able, through their wealth and wisdom, to keep the lower classes in check and protect liberty, specifically their liberty. Now, a demagogue, if you don't know, is a politician or public figure who gains favor and popularity through appealing to the masses. They promise everything to everyone. They avoid talking about pertinent issues, or they fail to talk about them rationally or coherently. They place blame on outsiders, they lie, and with the people's permission and encouragement, they consolidate power to protect the commoners from outside enemies. It is rumored that demagogues are also obsessed with their image and love golden escalators. Now, it's weird to read the secret proceedings of the Philadelphia Convention. That's where we got the two quotes from James Madison and Robert Morris Jr. We're taught in placid American history that democracy is what the Founding Fathers were after the whole time, which is why we have three branches of government, a robust system of checks and balances to ensure that our democracy, by and for the people, is upheld. But the arguments of the 1787 Convention, even in all their eloquence, suggested the people were unreliable, and indeed, they were the ones who needed to be checked, and by divine right, it was the American aristocracy who ought to check them. The difference between state representatives and members of Congress was literally the difference between discussing local needs and international needs, or culling coyote populations versus writing and understanding international treaties. These are matters that required some sort of broader, more worldly knowledge, which at the time was restricted to the wealthy. And this was not an argument that just came up when everyone was discussing the Constitution. This was a long-standing colony issue. Who ought to be represented, and who ought to be the representatives? And does it matter where the representative lives if he is simply better than all the hicks who could possibly represent their towns? Now, I'm not fucking with you on that. We take the residency of our politicians with at least a veneer of sincerity today. It seems obvious to us, but how can you possibly represent a place you don't live? One of the reasons for revolution in the first place. And if you at one time did live in a place, but then moved to Washington, D.C. for your lifetime appointment in the Senate, how can you still be a resident of that place you lived 20 years ago? Well, we take those answers for matter of fact. You can't. Quote, residence in the province, together with the ownership of property in the constituency, should be quite enough to qualify a representative, wrote William Douglas in a 1762 open feud with the state of Massachusetts, which had just passed a law requiring representatives to reside in the township they represent. Douglas argued for proximity. If you can see the township from the top of your roof, then that is good enough. If it's within a day's pony ride, all the better. One can see now, 150 years later, that the problem with this is that were you to follow Douglas's opinion, your only allegiance would be to your property and what you do with it, i.e. how you make money. You would be a representative of yourself by yourself. But Douglas was a much larger asshole than that. He qualified his position by shitting on the people who actually lived in those townships, claiming that to be a wealthy landowner, quote, of good natural interest and resident in the province, a man of reading, observation, and daily conversant with affairs of policy and commerce, is certainly better qualified for a legislator than a retailer of rum and small beer called a tavern keeper in a poor, obscure country town remote from all business, end quote. In other words, fuck these dumb hicks, I'm rich. In context, the attitudes and words of the Founding Fathers, the father of the Constitution, the father of the American financial system, and some random asshole from Massachusetts whom we'll use as a stand-in for the neo-aristocracy, echo the sentiments of British loyalists, those who urged the colonists not to support a revolution but passively accept British rule. The title of Reverend John Boucher's sermon on civil liberty, passive obedience, and non-resistance basically sums up the whole idea. Don't go seeking liberty, you already have it under the crown. But the title isn't the best part. He makes a point of sentiment that captures the instability of the democratic commoner as historic fact, one that Bernard Bailyn puts into context. Quote, "To argue that all men were equal would not make them so. It would only help justify and perpetuate that spirit of defiance, that refusal to concede to authority whose ultimate resolution could only be anarchy, demagoguery, and tyranny. If such ideas prevailed year after year, generation after generation, the latent spark in the breasts of even the most humble of men would be kindled again and again by entrepreneurs of discontent who would remind the people of the elevated rank they hold in the universe as men, that all men by nature are equal, that kings are but the ministers of the people, that their authority is delegated to them by the people for their good, and they have a right to resume it and place it in other hands or keep it themselves, whenever it's made use of to oppress them." End quote. Boucher's words, directed at the entirety of the colony, illustrate the fear that the American aristocracy held for democracy. We told them they're equal to us, and if we give them all the power, we're fucked. Where Boucher implored colonists to remain loyal to the crown, the Founding Fathers insisted, we'll be the crown. While it is true that we live in a republic, a large centralized government, it is also true that we live in a democracy. Kind of. It was granted that the commoners should elect the members of the House, and somehow today the 17th Amendment exists and we directly vote for the senators who represent our states in Washington. The people have managed to vote for the people, but the aristocracy, long gone are the wealthy landowners as rent seekers, lives on, keeping the power of the commoners in check. The Senate today in many ways functions as Madison, Morris, and Douglas believed it should. In spite of having far fewer members than the House of Representatives, it is indeed the ruling house that keeps the lower house and the commoners in check. And we still pay rent to the aristocracy, though not how you think. But for this, we have to actually discuss the phrase rent-seeking. In economics, this means whatever you want it to mean. For purposes of this book, refer to the earlier section where I discussed the enclosure of the commons. Public land, once fenced off and rid of commoners, was then used for the more profitable and more destructive wool industry. A guild seeking a large parcel to rent for increased wool production might entice a landowner to exercise or overextend his private property rights under common law, the law of the commoners, in exchange for a share of profits or something of value to the landowner. They're literally seeking rent from the aristocracy that takes advantage of the commoner. Facebook's transition from social network to seller of user data is an example of rent-seeking. Users had already given Facebook all of their personal information, and updating Facebook's user agreement to allow for the sale of data was the most profitable move Facebook made, as it required very little investment. Rent-seeking. Bonus. Don't Squeeze the Charmin is an example of rent-seeking in advertising. Charmin paid a marketing firm decades ago to come up with the phrase, "Don't squeeze the Charmin," and I'll be damned if I don't think it every time I see it in someone's bathroom. I repeat Charmin's slogan for them for free. Bonus, if you're an economist, I know exactly what you're thinking. Those are terrible examples of rent-seeking. Are they, though? Rent is the easiest profit to make, or the least risky way to make profit. A slogan that people repeat on their own that also makes them touch their product, that is a very safe way to make a profit. So is updating user agreements. Deregulation and lobbying, I'd argue, are the poorest examples, as they transfer resources rather than increase revenue, and they have the risk of public opinion attached to them. Bonus times 3. Let's go back to shoes. Say it's 1984, and you're watching this guy, Michael Jordan, playing preseason games with the Bulls in a high school gymnasium, and the kids are just fixated on Jordan. They're watching him the whole time, this young, brand new basketball player with no professional experience, and the kids cannot take their eyes off him. And you're thinking, man, this is like an hour-long Jordan show, and the kids aren't looking away. And then you think, I could put some weird-ass shoes on that guy. Huh. And then you give them the shoes. The NBA makes a big deal about it because they're so weird looking, and what do you know? Everyone buys the shoes. Those feet, untapped real estate. Those shoes, weird as hell. Nike, hey, will you wear these shoes? That's rent-seeking. Michael Jordan, will you give me a lot of money for wearing these shoes? Also rent-seeking. Before I bore into my point, it's worth backtracking to discuss the asshole Robert Morris Jr. The title, Father of the American Financial System, is intriguing but also vague. What is America's financial system? Charles Rapley goes into great detail in the biography Robert Morris, Financier of the American Revolution, and indeed I can't go into much detail whatsoever without relying heavily on Rapley. The short of it is this: we get insight into what a financier is, a master money mover, and this is what was needed with the American colony at war with Britain. Morris was responsible for procuring gunpowder, which he smuggled and personally financed. Morris was wealthy before the war, having learned the ins and outs of international shipping and trade. He shipped slaves, he shipped indentured servants, he shipped hogsheads. If it fits, it ships. He was also a land speculator and founder of the North American Land Company. Historian Aaron Sokolsky called it the largest land trust ever known, whatever that's worth. Morris's personal story mirrors the subject of the 2012 documentary Queen of Versailles, Jackie and David Siegel, who were owners of the timeshare company Westgate Resorts. Siegel over-leveraged his assets just as America entered the 2008 recession, and we see him in the middle of building a big-ass mansion that eerily halts construction as the recession hits. It's a story of absurd wealth and, with filmmaker Lauren Greenfield's eye, absurd risk. Morris also over-leveraged his wealth on risky land deals that resulted in defaulting on loans, avoiding creditors, and serving time in debtor's prison toward the end of his life. With that, I'll leave it to you to decide whether Morris is worth reading about further. Sokolsky and Rapley will serve you much better, but you'll probably fall asleep reading. What we should be interested in is Morris's actual role as America's financier and how that influenced the American financial system. Well, you see, it goes back to shipping, and you can think of Morris's career as a shipping entrepreneur as the driver of modern capitalism. Using his knowledge of shipping routes, Morris was indispensable as the guy who got shit done, bringing supplies to and from the Caribbean and Britain and France and Virginia and Pennsylvania. He shipped gunpowder and supplies directly to General George Washington and issued loans to the U.S. government. He literally issued his own money, Morris notes, which was the national fucking currency. He was, by all estimates, and despite how big an asshole he was, the U.S. bank. And, like Hawkenotting would be much, much later, he was the comptroller of the currency to the extreme, like supreme leader of the currency. John P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan, J.P. Morgan Chase, can also be added to the list of wealthy individuals who helped fund the U.S. government. In 1895, Morgan arranged a gold bond trade with President Cleveland to prevent U.S. gold reserves from dissolving. Yay, debt. Anyway, back to Morris the asshole. Morris was responsible for creating the Bank of North America. This was a private bank governed by investors that Morris oversaw. Oh, he was the comptroller, okay. Its function was to establish a stable monetary policy, essentially the modern function of the Fed, determine the size and rate of the money supply, take deposits, and supply loans. So what the fuck is monetary policy? That is how a nation handles money, historically printing money and stamping coins, but in modern time, policy includes short and long-term interest rates, flow of money, exchange rates, bonds, equities, derivatives, international investments, etc. The Fed is not much different today from Morris's Bank of North America. In fact, it's basically the same thing. 12 private banking corporations overseen by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Now, this may be confusing because it'd be better if you could actually see this diagram, but I'm going to take you on a word trip. We start at the tip of the human centipede of American finance with the U.S. government. The U.S. government, or more specifically the president, has 7 presidential appointments to the Federal Board of Governors, which oversees but cannot control the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve, which is 12 private banks, which are run by 12 bank presidents. If you're doing the math, that's 7 presidential appointments versus 12 bank presidents. The Fed controls money supply. They control loans made by commercial banks, and they distribute cash. You might be wondering, how do they do that? Well, they literally type numbers into checking accounts. That's what makes a loan from the Fed to another bank. And it sounds a lot like this. And from here we have to back up, all the way back to the U.S. government, which, if you recall, oversees but can't control the Fed. However, the U.S. government does control the Treasury, and they're responsible for printing money and some other stuff. The other stuff, maybe we'll get to it. It's not super important. Anyway, they print the money and then they send it over to the Fed. Now, here's the important thing about the Fed and the Federal Board of Governors. You might be wondering, how does the Board of Governors oversee the banks? Well, the Federal Open Market Committee is the Federal Board of Governors and 5 bank presidents. They meet 8 times a year to plan U.S. monetary policy. All right, so let's go back. So the Fed, the 12 private banks, they control the money supply, they control loans made by commercial banks, they distribute cash, and they give loans to commercial banks. More loans equals more money supply. But their responsibility doesn't end there. Because the Fed is responsible for typing numbers into checking accounts in the form of loans, they also... Hold on, let me follow this diagram. This will be fun. Where the fuck are we going? The Fed also provides financial services to depository institutions, foreign official institutions, and also the U.S. government, which, oversees the Fed, but the Fed provides financial services to the U.S. government, which oversees the Fed, which provides financial services to the... So it just goes in a circle. The U.S. government, Federal Board of Governors, the Fed, controls money supply, provides financial services to the U.S. government. Oh, wait. Here we go. Nope, it's just a circle. It just goes in a circle. So you just sit on that. Okay. So this is a steroidized version of Morris's Bank of North America, private banks creating a centralized government bank responsible for controlling the amount of money circulating in the economy. The Fed as we know it is not the actual descendant of Morris's first Bank of North America, and Alexander Hamilton usually gets all the credit for being the first person to set up a national bank, but we know now that's wildly incorrect. Thank you, Robert Morris. The Fed more or less took final form in 1913 when Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. And at the time it made sense. American banks were all over the fucking place. This wasn't like the Wild West. It was more like an orgy of incompetence and greed. So Wilson was like, all right, hedonists, we're going to do this under one roof, so bring your strap-ons. And we're going to call... So there was this whole shit show that happened around 1913. And there are a whole lot of names to choose from, but... I think my favorite is the Knickerbocker crisis, when the New York Stock Exchange fell 50% and people began pulling their money from banks en masse. Banks went bankrupt, some hoarded money and refused to hand out loans. It was a whole thing. It was a whole mess. There was a recession going on already, and get this, people made actual fucking bets on the stock market in bucket shops. Stock brokerages where brokers never actually sold stocks, just took bets on them, like people wagered money without actually buying stocks. It was a simpler time. Anyway, Wilson was hosting hedonists under the new Umbrella Corp Federal Reserve, and that's where we've been ever since. If you've taken effort to understand or even study the diagram, you might be wondering, is the Fed a system of privately owned banks? Surely not. They must be government institutions. Well, don't worry, because there is a very careful system in place that... Oh, wait. No, according to the Supreme Court case U.S. Shipping Board Emergency Fleet Corp versus Western Union Telegraph Co., 1928, quote, instrumentalities like the national banks or the Federal Reserve banks in which there are private interests are not departments of the government. They are private corporations in which the government has an interest. And according to Bozeman Financial LLC versus the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, quote, they are corporations chartered under the laws of the United States. Like national banks, reserve banks are chartered by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, end quote. Now, I don't mean to beat a dead horse with a wet blanket, but maybe the Supreme Court upholding the precedent that the Fed is a private banking system is enough to convince you that the U.S. government does not actually control America's monetary policy. That would be the assumption given the meetings of the Federal Open Market Committee, but keep in mind those are presidential appointments that can be changed with regularity according to the interests or whims of the president. And while boards of directors are also subject to change, the interests of the banks are not. If the banks were persons, you would be forgiven for thinking that their interests and goals are long-term, determined to keep and hold status and accumulate wealth. If the banks were persons, I wonder if banks are persons. Quote, first, the reserve banks are not structured as federal agencies. Congress structured the reserve banks as juridically separate entities, and because they are corporations, they are presumed to be persons under the Dictionary Act. End quote. Well, I think that clears things up. So, wait. What the fuck is a decentralized central banking system? God damn it, and the fucking Dictionary Act? Fuck. Decentralized central banking system. The Fed acts independently of the government, but is still accountable to the government. Congress still has the authority to amend the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. So what the fuck is a person? According to the Dictionary Act, under the Code of Laws of the United States of America, Chapter 1, Rules of Construction, quote, words denoting number, gender, and so forth in determining the meaning of any act of Congress unless the context indicates otherwise. The words person and whoever includes corporations, companies, associations, firms, partnerships, societies, and joint stock companies, as well as individuals. So just for context, person, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad Company, 1886, set the precedent for extending the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to corporations. The 14th Amendment, broadly speaking, grants citizenship rights and equal protection under U.S. law. This was specifically written to address issues related to former slaves following the Civil War. Equal Protection Clause, quote, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. End quote. Listen. The system that gave personhood to pieces of paper also decided decentralized central banking could be a thing that made sense. I can't explain it any further than that because it's nonsensical. I have a lot more to say about the worthlessness of U.S. pieces of paper. So let's go back to Robert Morris Jr., the asshole. Morris's ideas and attitudes about U.S. banking and finance were directly impacted by his views on trade, by his private career as a shipping merchant and future land speculator. And his ideas were rather common for the time, at least among the wealthy colonial subjects who then became wealthy Americans and founding fathers. They had immense wealth to play with, and playing with money is fun. Just look at Morris, buying land on speculation and then selling for a profit. Shipping whatever fits into a boat, even if it gets stolen by pirates. You just keep pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, but government interference fucks with your full ability to play with your money. Trade regulations, treaties, tariffs. Keep in mind that even though Morris was Comptroller 1.0, he still had financial interests tied up in his side hustles. How do you think he personally funded the U.S. government? The loans he made to the government were just another instance of Morris playing with money, and he got to be the money-playingest motherfucker in the whole country. Morris notes and all that. Thank God we don't have fucking Mnuchin notes. Unfortunately, actually quite fortunately, we don't have a Robert Morris Jr. asshole in the modern American financial system. Actually we have 12 of them in the Fed. While no single human being with a heartbeat holds enough wealth to finance wars and hand out loans to foreign governments, keep in mind that the joy of money fuckery is still alive and well, as evidenced by the Federal Reserve banking system, the decentralized central conglomerate of non-government private person corporations that receive direct cash injections into their broadband veins in the form of wire transfers with a shitload of zeros behind them. Don't worry though. There are 7 presidential appointees who oversee their activities 8 times a year. Now, the rest of the time, they do whatever the fuck they want. Now, if you're like me, you might be stuck on something that's in my flow chart a few pages back. It's that funny line where money printed by the United States Treasury goes directly to the Fed for distribution, and one of its paths goes right back to the U.S. government. And you might be wondering, what does the Fed do for the United States? Hell, let's take it straight from the horse's mouth. The Fed is responsible for, quote, providing certain financial services to the U.S. government, U.S. financial institutions, and foreign official institutions, and playing a major role in operating and overseeing the nation's payment systems, end quote. Well, that is fucking vague. The Fed is responsible for maintaining accounts for the U.S. Treasury, processing government checks, money orders, and U.S. savings bonds, and collecting federal tax deposits. Those are the taxes withheld from your paycheck and the FICA taxes your employer has to pay for paying you. They also hold assets like securities, derivatives, gold stock, foreign currencies, and special drawing rights. Just to make sure we're all squared away, the Treasury prints money and distributes it through the Fed. They also sell securities, but more on that later. The Fed then loans that money to banks by wiring a bunch of zeros to accounts and sends cash dollars to banks. If a bank has too much cash money, they send it to the Fed, and banks send in used, dirty, torn up money to be replaced with crisp hundies. When you see Medicare and Social Security taxes taken out of your paycheck, it's gone back to the Fed because the Fed handles that kind of thing for the U.S. government. And I want to go back to those crisp hundies. Let's play a trivia game. All you need is everything you have with you right now, if you're nude. If you're dressed, then you are way overprepared for this game. Let's say it's the eve of Inauguration Day, and the smell of civil war is in the air. Assholes have stormed the Capitol, leaving 7 dead, 2 Capitol officers by suicide. Something even more fucked up is bound to happen if you're a guy who fucking lost but is too much of a fucking pussy to admit it, isn't inaugurated, and you're worried about cash for the next 5 years of fighting in the American trenches with your AR-15. What do you do? I'll wait for you to put your pants on. You go to the fucking bank because by January 21st, banks will basically be piles of rubble, right? This was, at least, the very serious contemplation of many who secretly wish for bloody rebellion against, I'm not sure what exactly they were afraid of on January 6th, but the thinking of those brave Americans is not unusual. When people fear impending economic collapse, their intuition is to run to the bank and withdraw all of their money. Never mind the fact that in the event of real economic collapse, them dollars ain't worth nothing. This is known as a bank run or a bank panic. The slightly comical thing is that it has the exact effect that people are worried about. The banks run out of money when everyone wants to withdraw funds or exchange funds for something of value, like bonds or gold or Air Force Ones. Rushing a bank in a panic would literally wipe them clean. Boom, bankrupt, no cash, out of business. Now, there are very complex schemes in place to prevent abrupt bank failure, like reserves, deposit insurance, and the Fed, known as the lender of last resort, the last place your bank can turn to for a loan to prevent collapse. Now, let's just think in the abstract for a moment. What if instead of a bank run, we did the complete opposite? A bank walk, waltz, calisthenics. None of that makes sense, so we'll just call it a bank flogging. Instead of doing a bank yank, you head over there with pantaloons full of bills and you say, "Here, I never want to see these fucking slave owners again. Give me a fucking piece of plastic, you piece of shit." And then, wearing a smile and ill-fitting suit, the person at the weird desk in the middle of the bank gives you a debit card and all your problems are solved. You never have to touch money again because this is the 21st century, and let's face it, if you need cash, you'll say fuck it and pay $3.50 to get it out of a machine on the street. But it's not just you. It's the entire city rushing into the banks yelling, "Fuck these dollars!" and the entire nation is screaming, "Burn the money!" But instead of burning it, they deposit it after filling out a slip for 20 minutes in the drive-up line. Everyone everywhere has deposited their cash and in exchange taken a little piece of plastic that, when you put it in a terminal, shows you a few numbers that you can convert to slave owner paper, if you want it. Jesus, you've just made the banks a fucking fortune, right? Kind of. Actually, you just made a bunch of money out of nothing. Banks are required through the reserve system to keep a certain amount of your cash on hand, but they are required to loan out the rest. You put in $100 and the bank has to keep, let's just say a fake number, $10 on hand, but they can loan out $90. You come back the next day and you're like, "Yeah, this is embarrassing, but I have to buy weed for my mom," and you spend 20 minutes filling out the withdrawal slip and they give you your $100 back. The $90 they loaned out is still floating around somewhere. You created $90. If you just held onto that $100, then some other asshole wouldn't have had the $90 and the bank wouldn't be making interest on the loan. Money, money everywhere. And this is why you have to fill out a bunch of forms and the bank calls your best friend from middle school when you take out a loan. They really need you to not default on that loan, because then when some guy comes in needing his $100 back, the bank would just be like, "Well, someone defaulted, so the money is gone. Have a dum-dum." Unacceptable. Okay, another thought experiment. While you're licking your dum-dum because you just got told to go away because someone defaulted on their loan, you see someone hanging outside the bank not wearing any shoes and you're like, "Becca? Hey, it's been like forever. What are you doing at the bank?" And she's like, "I took out a loan to buy Air Force Ones and then I lost my job, so the bank took my Air Force Ones. I love your belt." Huh. The bank just told me that someone defaulted on my money they handed out and they gave me a sucker instead. Huh. Yeah, I'm going to go inside and see if they'll give me the shoes they took away from you. "Oh, hey, can I wear them if they give them to you? They won't fit you." "Fuck you, Becca, you're poor." And now the bank has lost $100 and gained a pair of Air Force Ones. Becca has no shoes and you're an asshole. This is a very small bank, so you and Becca are the only people who've used it, so it fails. Boom, dead. The small hiccup in this analogy is that the FDIC will cover your $100, and then, as previously discussed, they will find a Steve Mnuchin to come in and purchase the bank's assets and assume its liabilities, or the loan on the Air Force Ones. Assuming that Becca is indeed really poor, so poor that she should just go fuck herself, then Steve Mnuchin will just wind up taking the shoes and you'll still get your $100 deposit back. That's how banks work. They have reserve requirements to meet, and after they take your deposit, they just loan out the rest. They earn interest on the reserve, but they don't earn interest on excess reserves. That really depends on the time and place. It's like they can't decide if reserve interest is good or bad, and some economists have argued that they should incur negative interest on excess reserves, and some economists theorize that holding too much in reserve puts the banks at risk at failure. Well, okay, none of that matters. So anyway, where did that $10 reserve go when you initially made your $100 deposit and the bank held on to that $10? In theory, it went into the vault in the back of the bank. In reality, it went to the Fed. The Fed holds all cash reserves, including excess reserves. Is it in a vault? A giant vault, say the size of a football field, filled with pallets of $100 bills double stacked on top of each other? That's roughly the size of $1 trillion. Well, sure, there's a vault somewhere, but that's not where your money goes when you deposit it. It goes into a fucking computer, and the Fed keeps track of all that data, 1 trillion dollar bytes or something. The real reason the 2008 financial crash was so bad was that the Fed ran out of zeros on the computer. It only goes up to like a quadrillion. So you see, when there's a market crash, the Excel spreadsheet just gives up, and you wonder what reference code it's vomiting out because it's the same goddamn formula you always use. Oh, wait, that's an O instead of a 0. Why the fuck are they so close? All of our government accounting is done on a computer. Interest rates, reserves. Hey, have you figured out why they call it the Reserve Bank yet, and how a centralized bank helps keep track of the entire economy by letting all the bank activity flow into it like it's a bullseye soaking up arrows made of money? Great. Anyway, they also do accounting like interest rates, reserves, money market funds, derivatives, foreign currency, and gold and silver. The Fed handles it all, no job too big or too small unless it comes to adding zeros somewhere. It's not fair to say all of our government accounting is done on a computer. I'm sure there's someone in the Fed's basement with an abacus scribbling shit down on a legal pad like, oh, I never should have asked Mnuchin about that mole on his face.
Turn tape over.